Joseph Edward Duncan led a very troubled life, a life that led to him being sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms, and he waited for execution on death row for numerous counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. If you've been binging and have caught up to this point, I appreciate you coming back. And if this is your first time listening, welcome. I hope that you'll stick around and be sure to subscribe to 10-Minute Murder if you want to listen to more in the future. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And multiple people have messaged me on one of those places recently because in an episode I mentioned banana bread recipes. I don't know why I said it. I don't really love banana bread. But because I said it, I've been flooded with recipes. Now let me say this in the nicest possible way. I'm never going to make that banana bread. I don't care if it's your Meemaw's recipe or Gordon Ramsay. I'm just not really a fan of banana bread. And in the future, I need to be careful, I guess, about what I say here because you guys will send it to me. And with that being said, here's what I think is actually cool. $1 million. Those new Mercedes G63s, the G-Wagon, those are also cool. If you need my address, let me know. All right, now to today's story. Joseph Edward Duncan was born on February 25, 1963 in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to a military family. And this meant that because of his father's job, Joseph and his 4 other brothers and sisters would have to move every couple of years, sometimes just to other states and other times to a completely different country. But when Joseph's father retired, the family settled in Tacoma, Washington. And here's a fun fact about me and how lives can sometimes parallel or intersect with serial killers. I was born at the exact same place as Joseph Duncan, many years later, obviously, but at the same place, and my father was in the military, so we moved around a lot exactly like Joseph's family did, and when my father retired, he retired in the South, so that's why I live in the South. But one of my best friends that I made while my dad was in the military, I met in Germany, and he lives in Washington with his family, and those details seem pretty interesting to me. And his name is Joseph, and obviously so is mine, but that's where the comparisons should end. It was in Washington that Joseph would start on a very dark and twisted path. By the age of 15, he had committed his first documented sexual assault. He attacked a 9-year-old boy and assaulted him at gunpoint. Just a year later, he was arrested for stealing a car, and he was sent to Dislin's Boys Ranch to hopefully straighten him out. But when he got there, he revealed to the therapist that he'd already assaulted around 13 younger boys. By the age of 15, Joseph Edward Duncan was a serial sexual offender. 2 years after that, Joseph was back in Tacoma. He stole guns from his neighbor and assaulted a 14-year-old boy at gunpoint again. But this time things were different. Joseph was now an adult and he was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He didn't serve that full 20 though. 14 years is what he served, and 2 years after he was released, he was arrested yet again. This time it was for using marijuana, and he was released with extra conditions added to his parole. He'd be arrested just a year later for violating his parole, but would get off early for good behavior and ended up moving to Fargo, North Dakota in 2000. Things were a little quiet after that, but in March of 2005, Joseph was charged with molesting 2 boys at a playground in Minnesota, and his bail was set at $15,000. By this point, he had become friendly with a local businessman who actually posted his bail for him, but Joseph took this opportunity to skip town, and after that, a federal warrant was issued for his arrest. Joseph Edward Duncan stayed on the run, but that didn't mean he was keeping a low profile. In May of 2005, just 2 months after the warrant for his arrest was issued, Joseph murdered almost an entire family. Shasta was just 8 years old when her mother, Brenda Green, called her into the living room in their home just outside the city of Coeur d'Alene. But when she got there, Shasta saw Joseph standing there wearing black gloves and pointing a gun at the rest of her family. She watched as Joseph tied up her mother's fiancé, Mark McKenzie, and her older brother, Slade, with zip ties. And then Joseph took Shasta and her little brother, Dylan, and put them in the back of his car. While they were waiting for Joseph to come back, Shasta and Dylan watched as their older brother, Slade, who was only 13 at the time, made his way to the front door, but then he stumbled backwards, and then they never saw him again. Joseph had hit Slade in the back of the head with a hammer, and he'd done the same thing to the rest of the family who was still inside the home. When he was satisfied with his work, he took off with the two children in his car. He took them to a makeshift camp far out into the countryside, and it was there that he told the two children in detail what exactly he had done to their family. And it was also there that he started torturing and molesting Shasta and Dylan. This all went on for 7 weeks, and Joseph would sometimes film and take pictures of what he was doing to the children. And in one of these, you can see a naked Joseph screaming at a crying child and saying, quote, "The devil is here, boy, the devil himself. The devil likes to watch children suffer and cry." But as terrible as that all was, Joseph wasn't done yet. One day, while the children were staying in this makeshift camp out in the countryside, Shasta was standing by Joseph's car when she heard a loud bang. She heard her brother crying, clearly in a lot of pain. She ran to see what was going on. Joseph had been reaching for something in the cooler in the back of his car, and he'd knocked over his sawed-off shotgun, making the gun fire, and Dylan was hit in the stomach. Dylan fell to the ground and was crying, holding his stomach and bleeding everywhere. But Joseph knew what he had to do, according to him. He picked up a shotgun, held it to the boy's head, and pulled the trigger. But the gun didn't go off. Dylan sat there, begging for his life. But Joseph, after a quick inspection of the gun, put it to his head again and pulled the trigger. And this time the gun went off, killing Dylan instantly, right in front of his sister. He then turned to Shasta and started crying, telling her that it had all been an accident and that he'd only killed Dylan to put him out of his misery. But the incident clearly shook him. Just a few days later, Joseph gave Shasta a choice, telling her that he was going to kill her too, but she should choose if she wanted him to strangle her or shoot her. Shasta chose for him to strangle her. Joseph then tied a rope around her neck and began pulling. Shasta fought back, but she was only 8 years old. She had been abused and mistreated for weeks and stuck out in the wilderness with very little food, so all she could really do was beg. She begged Joseph not to kill her, but he continued. It wasn't until she called him by his nickname, Jet, that Joseph just stopped. He was quiet for a little bit, and then he looked at Shasta and asked her if she wanted to meet his mother. And Shasta said yes. The two got into Joseph's car and drove. They eventually stopped at a restaurant on their way into town, and here things took a different turn. Amber Alerts had been issued about both Shasta and Dylan, and two waitresses plus the manager at this restaurant actually recognized Shasta. So they called the police, and they made sure that they could keep Joseph and Shasta in the restaurant until the police arrived, and Shasta was rescued. After hearing everything Shasta had to say, the police knew that there was basically no hope of finding Dylan alive, but they did manage to find his remains. They actually had to send them to the lab for testing to be done to identify him because of the damage done to his body from the shotgun blasts. Shasta was reunited with her father, and this time Joseph was going away for good. He was charged and given 3 consecutive life sentences for the kidnapping of the Shasta family, but he'd crossed the state lines when he'd taken Shasta and Dylan to his camp, and that made this a federal case, so he had to go to federal court for that part. He was sentenced to death for what he had done to the family, but during those weeks alone in his camp, Joseph admitted to Shasta about killing 3 more children, and she remembered the details that Joseph told her. She relayed that information to the police about a 10-year-old boy and 2 sisters that Joseph said he'd murdered. The police were able to use that information and find evidence and prove that this was true. He was charged for the murder of that 10-year-old boy, but at that point, he was already on death row. He was still given 2 more life sentences, but after a lengthy battle of appeals and additional court cases, Joseph was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer. Doctors gave him 6 months to a year to live, but Joseph died just a few months later, in March of 2021. A pretty anticlimactic death for someone who'd caused so much suffering and pain throughout his whole life. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I appreciate you listening today, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to 10-Minute Murder and go back and listen to some of the other stories that are available. I don't know how many episodes there are. I don't exactly keep up with that, but I know that there are over 200. Connect with me on social media and see the visuals that go along with the episodes you hear me talking about. Links for that are in the episode notes. Also in the episode notes, a link for the 10-Minute Murder merch store. If you want stickers or t-shirts or anything like that, it's available. Thank you for listening today. Be safe and make good choices.